Hey guys, we've gone through the summary and we've looked at the larger than oneself view and the bipartite theory. I don't think we in the summary pointed out that she was really critical of the bipartite theory, probably because of the way that was laid out in the textbook. I don't think it really flagged that this is the bipartite theory and here are issues with it. We definitely see that in the reading, okay? So let's look at our prior knowledge that we got from the summary. And let's add to it. We need to get the nuances, which we get here a lot because we get the qualifications, we get the extra information, the extra opinions, and we get the extra examples, okay? And then we'll discuss how they should complement each other. But from her point of view, it's not just about complementing. Like, the bipartite theory is where you have an objective and subjective criterion for meaningfulness. But she doesn't believe that that's enough. The two actually have to interact with each other. So she doesn't really agree with the bipartite theory either. She doesn't really agree with this idea of complementing each other. She wants to see them interact, and we'll see what that has to do with the fitting view of fulfillment. We'll have a look at that next. So let's start reading, shall we? All right, if I'm quick, I'm just trying to make sure that we get through this content in a way that keeps you engaged. So the second view that tells us the best sort of life is one that is involved or contributes to something larger than oneself, or contemplation. Let's go over that again. The second view that tells us that the best sort of life is one that is involved in or contributes to something that is larger than oneself. Contemplation of the case of Sisyphus should, however, be enough to show that this larger must be understood metaphorically, not literally. We may, after all, imagine the rock that Sisyphus is endlessly pushing uphill to be very large. We might rather understand the view that one that recommends involvement in something more important than ourselves. Something, in other words, that is larger than ourselves, not in size, but of value. She has an issue with this. She cautions us against that as well. If the recommendation is to be taken as a criterion for a meaningful life, however, I would be inclined to argue against this interpretation too. For one thing, if we assume that the value of one person's life is as great as the value of another's, which most of us do, all life has equal value, it would seem to rule out the possibility that a life devoted to the care of a single other individual, or a disabled partner, for example, or a frail aging parent, or a child with special needs, could be a meaningful life, for the value of one cared for is presumably just equal to and not larger than the value of the person who does the caring. So if you're confused, remember she's cautioning us against the interpretation that the thing that is larger than yourself is really metaphorically the thing that is more important, because that would imply that the more important thing has more value. And why would people say that it is meaningful to get engaged with someone else's life and help them if that person is of equal value? Take a note. When we try to assess projects and activities that are not principally aimed at the benefit of one or more human beings, the difficulties with such a view appear even more serious. Presumably a dog is not more important than oneself, but what about 2 dogs or 6? What about projects and activities that are not directed towards promoting anyone's welfare at all? Is philosophy or poetry or basketball something larger than oneself in value? It is difficult to know exactly what the question is asking, so we can't make incommensurable comparisons between people's lives. And we have this kind of number equations where we say, like, a dog's life, 6 dogs might be better at getting involved than just 1 dog. Again, that just seems really farcical, doesn't it? This idea of more value because of more importance, it doesn't make sense. And what about things that people would argue doesn't really contribute to importance but still provides people with meaningfulness? That's what she's saying. A more promising interpretation of the view that links meaningfulness to involvement with something larger than oneself takes the metaphor of size less seriously. According to this interpretation, the point is to recommend that one get involved not with something larger than oneself, but with something other than oneself. Write that down. That is, with something the value of which is independent of and has its source outside of oneself. Write that down. Perfect definition of what she means by getting involved in something larger than oneself. It's more about getting involved in something that has a source of value from outside of oneself and it's independent from oneself. And this can't be the case in Sisyphus, because the only way that he could even think, or even we could think, that the rolling of the ball up the hill has value is because he subjectively thinks it does, right? the source of the value comes from his subjective attribution of it when he's being deluded. Okay? Presumably, Sophian stonewalling has no such value, nor it seems does pot smoking or Sudoku solving. But devotion to a single needy individual does not satisfy this condition as much as devotion to a crowd. Philosophy and basketball appear to meet the criterion too, since the value of one of these activities, whatever it is, does not depend on one's own contingent interest in them. But devotion to a single needy individual does satisfy this need as much as it does to satisfying a crowd. So we don't do numbers, and we don't factor in size. We don't make incommensurable comparisons, and also with things that don't seem to maximize welfare, though I'd argue philosophy does for sure. Again, the source of the value is independent. Take a note. Actually, I think philosophy is really valuable. I think it's one of the most important subjects because it teaches you about leadership, about power, about broadening your horizons, broadening. So it's actually quite an important subject. If we interpret the advice that one get involved with something larger than self in this way, it might be thought to represent a second and independent criterion for a fully successful and flourishing life. Combining this advice with the fulfillment view, one might think yields a better bipartite conception of meaningfulness than either view taken on its own. So the thing is, when she defines the bipartite conception of meaningfulness, what she is doing in effect is she's saying we have one criterion to tick off and another to tick off. One is the subjective fulfillment one, the other is the objective larger than oneself one. Tick them off. But the two don't interact, and she's got issues with this. How is she going to point out the issues? Well, then we'll look about how that's the case later when she does some thought experiments, okay? So the fulfillment view directs our attention, so you get the bipartite conception of meaningfulness than either view taken on its own. The fulfillment view directs our attention to a subjective component that a meaningful life must contain. But as the case of Sisyphus fulfilled led us to see, even a life that fully satisfied the subjective condition may be one we would be hesitant to describe as meaningful, if objectively that life were unconnected to anything or anyone whose value lay outside of the person whose life it was. So again, in the case of Sisyphus, we can't really objectively see how the rolling the ball up the hill has some kind of criterion or some kind of objective value, right? By conjoining the fulfillment view with the injunction to get involved with something larger than oneself, we get a proposal that appears to remedy the problem. So most people would say the bipartite theory addresses the issue of sufficient and necessary conditions, but she's going to say no, all right, because it's not actually sufficient to just have the two. You need to have the interaction between the two to create the sufficiency, all right? On this bipartite view, in order for a life to be meaningful, both an objective and subjective condition must be met. A meaningful life is a life that A, the subject finds fulfilling, and B, contributes to or connects positively with something, the value of which has its source in the outside subject. So can you write down that this is her definition of the bipartite theory? Again, she's got issues with it, and note that down as well. If, however, meaningfulness is understood to refer to a coherent, so it's an understandable dimension of value, which will be meaning, more specific than a general category of self-interest, or even more general category of all that is desirable in life, it would be puzzling if it turned out to depend on the satisfaction of two unrelated conditions. That's where she's getting at. We've got two criterion to tick off, but they're not related to each other yet, all right? Note that down. The proposal I favour, which identifies meaning with a condition in which subjective and objective components are suitably linked, conceives of meaningfulness in a more unified way. In other words, they are related. Note that down. My conception of meaningfulness sees subjective and objective elements fitting together. This is why she has a fitting view of fulfillment coming up later on. They work together, they interact, they fit, they overlap, all right, fitting together to constitute a coherent feature a life might or might not possess. So not kind of like two separate criteria, but merge them together, maybe to create one bigger criterion, and maybe that bigger criterion was reflected in what was stated before in the conceptions of a meaningful life, which was, meaning is created when one acts out of reasons for love on a worthy object in a positive way, right? Again, that's a unified kind of criterion for assessing what meaningfulness is, rather than going, is it fulfilling, tick, is it larger than oneself, tick. You get what I mean? The two have to interact. Take a note. So, besides, if we really consider the two conditions of meaningfulness proposed by the bipartite view as criteria to be taken separately, it is not clear that they contribute to the goodness of a person's life at all. We're going to have a look at how this is the case. So, consider again the suggestion that a life in which a person contributes to something larger than himself, suitably interpreted, is more meaningful than a life that serves only the needs and desires of a person whose life it is. So, fulfillment versus the objective life dedicated to something larger than yourself. Some people would say that if you dedicate your life to something larger than yourself, that's more meaningful than just living a life based on self-interest. All right? So consider that as a thought experiment. I introduced this idea in answer to the question of what desirable feature might be missing in a life that Sisyphus fulfilled, or the pot smoker or the Sudoku player, that prevents it from representing a life we would want for ourselves or for those who we love. We could add stipulations to these examples that guaranteed that the protagonists' lives and activities did contribute to some sort of independent value. So here's the thing. If you are engaged in an activity that is larger than yourself, it's easy to see that you are probably contributing to something or some independent value. If you go to war, you're fighting for the good of your country. You're trying to protect your community. You're contributing to a value independent of yourself, a value that is outside of yourself, yeah? But if they had no interest in the external or objective or independent value with which their lives were involved, however, it is not clear that the involvement would make their lives better or more desirable for them. So I'm a conscripted soldier who's just going along, not really interested, doesn't identify with the goals, possibly contributing to the serving of the nation, which is that independent value, but it's not something that I really value myself. Consider that situation for now, right? So imagine, so Sisyphus, his stone rolling scares the vultures who would otherwise attack a nearby community and spread terror and disease. Or imagine that the pot smoker's secondary marijuana smoke is alleviating the pain of the AIDS victim next door. If Sisyphus and the pot smoker do not care about the benefits their lives are producing, it is hard to see why the fact that their lives yielded those benefits that they contribute, or in other words, to something larger or of themselves, should make us any more inclined to describe their lives as meaningful. You get it? So again, from the endoxic method, from us considering our assumptions and our views, for them living a meaningful life, it's hard to say that your life is meaningful if you're that conscripted soldier who doesn't really care about your country, even though you're contributing to your country's survival, which is an external source of value. Take a note. So how do we put this in terms? How can you say that it's more important to contribute to something larger than yourself than to look after your own personal interests? You can't do that, right? If you do that, that doesn't necessarily mean that you are living a meaningful life. It just means you're contributing to an external source of value. Take a note. Okay. Other than themselves, should make us any more inclined to describe their lives as meaningful or to find their lives desirable than we were before we learned about the consequences. Even when we consider people whose involvement with something larger is less accidental, the contribution this makes to the quality of their own lives is limited at best if they are not emotionally engaged with the people or things or activities that make what they are doing valuable. You've got to underline that. You need to be emotionally engaged with the thing. Again, this is where she's critical of the bipartite theory. You could tick off the objective thing, tick off that thing, but where's the engagement? Where's the discussion about the importance of the actual relationship between the two? Yeah. People who do valuable work but cannot identify or take pride in what they are doing, the alienated housewife, the conscripted soldier, or the assembly line worker, for example, may know that what they are doing is valuable, yet reasonably feel that their lives lack something that might be referred to as meaningful. Take a note. in any case, it seems to me that when the recommendation to get involved with something larger than oneself is offered, it is offered in the hope, if not the expectation, that if one does get involved, it will make one feel good. The thought is that if one tries it, one will like it, and one will like it in part because of one's recognition that one is engaged with the person or object or an activity that is of independent value. The suggestion then that one gets meaning in life through involvement with something larger than oneself may be most charitably interpreted as a suggestion that it is not meant to be taken in isolation. In other words, you don't just interpret that criterion by itself. When you actually are trying to suggest that one gets involved in what allows them to engage in something outside of themselves, you're also suggesting and implying that you will have a subjective yearning or care for it or a subjective interest in it. Yeah, take a note. It is not to be regarded as a criterion of meaningfulness separable from any assumptions about the attitudes the subject will have towards the project or activity in question. Can you please note that? That's perfect. That's so clear. So you don't just make the suggestion to get involved in something larger than yourself without really implying that the subject is not going to have any kind of attachment or to the project or activity in question. Okay. If one gets involved in something larger than oneself, or as I have interpreted, in something the value of which is in part independent of oneself, then one is lucky if one will find that involvement fulfilling. And if that happens, then one's life will be and seem meaningful. If one's involvement brings no such reward, however, it is clear that it contributes to meaning. It is unclear that it contributes to meaning in one's life at all. Take a note. So just as the objective condition sometimes is associated with meaning, namely that one's life be involved in something larger than oneself, it is much more plausible when it is understood to function in conjunction, which means to function with a positive subjective attitude to one's involvement. So it seems to me that the subjective condition, that one live in a way that one finds fulfilling, is more plausible when understood in conjunction with the objective constraints. So what she's saying is that you don't consider the two criteria as working in isolation with each other. Again, if you want to have a look at how living according to, this is how they are connected in this paragraph, right? This is how she's trying to connect them. If you want to recommend that somebody lives a life where they dedicate themselves to something bigger than oneself, and you believe that will make their life meaningful, you also have an understanding that the person will have a positive subjective attitude towards it in order to have meaning out of it. The two are not separable. They are not independently stripped away from each other. You don't go tick, tick. You know that that recommendation also implies that they find a positive subjective attachment to what they do, right? That's you already know that that's the only way they're going to find meaning. So they are related to each other. Meaning can't exist without the two working together. Again, like she said in the other section, if you recommend that one finds a passion in life and lives by it, you also know in your heart of hearts that that object that they find to be passionate about, that activity that they find to be passionate about, has to have an objective sense of worth, because you can be deluded into doing something that you think is fulfilling when it's not. So she's saying that the two, you can't have one without the other. The two actually work together. They're not two separate criteria to go tick, tick, right? Take a note. All right, so I suggested a moment ago that when someone recommends that you get involved in something larger than oneself, the hope is, and they always imply this, guys, that it is that lurking in the background you will find an involvement subjectively rewarding. So she's saying that when you make the recommendation from the objective call, you actually are also implying the subjective call, right? Take a note. Similarly, when someone recommends that you find your passion and go for it, there also seems to be a hope, if not an expectation, lurking in the background, namely that the passion you find The pursuit will be fulfilling, will be an intelligible one with certain boundaries, i.e. it has worth. Right? So when you make a recommendation that someone finds a passion, you're also hoping that objectively it's worth it. Again, you don't make one without saying the other. Meaning involves a link between the two. Okay? You will not be passionate, at least not for very long, about something, about stonewalling or Sudokus or caring for goldfish or making handwritten copies of War and Peace. In my earlier discussion of Sisyphus Fulfilled, I expressed sympathy with those who, unlike Richard Taylor, found something desirable missing from Sisyphus's life, despite him being subjectively quite content. There's room for an even stronger disagreement with Taylor, however, that I want to consider now. Specifically, one might wonder whether the transformation that Sisyphus undergoes from being unhappy to bored, undergoes from being unhappy, bored, and frustrated to being blissfully fulfilled, makes Sisyphus better off at all. She doesn't think that it does. One might think that it actually makes his situation worse. Of course it would, because it's not real. It's not authentic. Take a note. From a hedonistic perspective, of course, Sisyphus' transformation, remember we're talking about hedonism from the point of view of good feelings, of which feelings of fulfillment are good feelings. So it might be different from pleasure in a conventional sense and happiness. So from a hedonistic perspective, of course, Sisyphus' transformation must make his life better. So for hedonists, we have to conclude that. For the only changes in Sisyphus are subjective, and hedonism is a subjective philosophy. Take a note. Negative feelings and attitudes are replaced by positive ones. From a non-hedonistic perspective, however, these changes come at a cost, right? Because again, non-hedonistic perspectives are still about value, right? But the value is not necessarily, good feelings in this case, okay? So she's saying you would probably feel negative feelings, but from a non-hedonistic perspective, these changes come at a cost because obviously you need to go through suffering, stress, anxiety, disappointment in order to acquire meaning on the way as you overcome it. So the cost is you're not accruing meaning, that other value. Take a note. When I try to understand the new Sisyphus' state of mind, when I try to imagine how someone might find stonewalling fulfilling, I can conceive of two possibilities. On the one hand, I can think of the substance in Sisyphus' veins as inducing delusions that make Sisyphus see something in the stonewalling that isn't really there. So this is where the nuances come in. He's deluded into thinking that stonewalling is fantastic, and maybe he thinks he's eating ice cream as he does it. That's what the substance is doing. I don't know. So that's one way we can interpret the way that he finds it fulfilling. Or the other way is, on the other hand, the drug in his veins has lowered his intelligence and reduced his imaginative capacity, thus eliminating his ability to perceive the dullness and futility of his labours or to compare them with other more challenging, worthwhile things. Had the gods not condemned him, he might have been doing instead. In either case, Sisyphus is in at least one respect worse off than he was before his transformation. He is either afflicted by mental illness or delusions, or diminished in his intellectual powers. And again, too, by being deluded, he's not able to accrue meaningfulness, right? He's able to accrue good feelings or pleasure and happiness, even a subjective sense of fulfillment, but he's not able to accrue meaningfulness. He doesn't get that. So he is worse off because, again, as she said before, in the conception of meaning, the fact that we undergo and that we pursue a goal or a task, regardless of the fact that it is going to cause negative feelings, it affirms that meaning has value. So he's worse off because he's not going to get that value. But that's something that we actually want, because experience tells us that people go through those negatives in order to get it. Take a note. Opinion may divide over whether, all things considered, the transformation makes Sisyphus worse or better off. Those in the strongest sympathy with Mills, utilitarian guys, so, subjective hedonist, claim that it is better to be a human unsatisfied than a pig satisfied, may think that, however bad the fate of the classical Sisyphus, the fate of the transformed Sisyphus is worse. I was confusing Bentham with Mills. Of course, Mills would say there's higher and lower pleasures, right? It's better to be a human unsatisfied than a pig satisfied because we have more capacity for higher pleasure. Others may conclude that, well, since Sisyphus is condemned to roll stones in any case, it's better off for him to be happy with, or more precisely fulfilled by, his lot than otherwise. Even those who hold the view that it is better to be Sisyphus happy than Sisyphus unhappy, however, may agree that it's better to still not be Sisyphus at all. So again, from this point of view, Sisyphus is worse off because he can't pursue meaning. He's got happiness, he's deluded to having it. That's a purely subjective experience. People want meaning, he can't get it. Take a note. To me, the first scenario in which transformed Sisyphus is deluded seems a more plausible way to understand what it would be for Sisyphus to be or to feel fulfilled by stone rolling. For fulfillment seems to me to include a cognitive component that requires seeing the source or object of fulfillment as being, in some independent way, good or worthwhile. So fulfillment has that subjective creation of worthwhileness, but not the objective one. All right. Even deep and intense pleasures like lying on the beach on a beautiful day or eating a perfectly ripe peach would not naturally be described as fulfilling. To find something fulfilling is rather to find it such a find it as to be characterizable in terms that will portray it as objectively good. All right, so yeah, okay, she's contradicting herself here. Fulfillment seems to include a cognitive component that requires the source or objective fulfillment as being in some independent way good or worthwhile. So even she's saying that the theory of itself contradicts itself. To be fulfilled, there needs to be objective worth, even though she's saying the fulfillment view focuses only on subjective impressions. So it gets a bit confusing here. Maybe she's saying there's a contradiction built into just the idea of fulfillment in general. Take a note. Right. Imagine Sisyphus in terms of either scenario, however, imagining Sisyphus in terms of either scenario, however, can explain why we might hesitate to describe the life of Sisyphus fulfilled as meaningful. Again, she's going back to the original idea of the fulfillment view. It's hard because he may feel that he's fulfilled, but we would say that it's not meaningful because of that lack of objective worth in the activity. And similarly, I would argue why we would withhold that label from the life of the fulfilled pot smoker, goldfish lover, or Tolstoy copier. Right. Imagining these characters in the model of either scenario would, in any case, help to explain why we might regard the lives as far from ideal. Earlier I suggested that we might judge these lives as to be missing something, a phrase that suggests a feature separable from fulfillment that these lives lack, rendering them less than optimally meaningful, if meaningful at all. In light of our discussion, we can see now that even the apparent condition of meaningfulness, we can now see that even the apparent condition of meaningfulness they do satisfy, that is the condition of being fulfilled, is in a certain way defective and less desirable than fulfillment stemming from a more fitting and appropriate source. So now we can make a prediction. The next section is going to be about fitting fulfillment. In other words, getting fulfillment, but from a fitting source. That's probably where we're going, all right? So, and that again talks about the connection between the two criteria, all right? Let's go back to our success criteria. We draw it from prior knowledge. I think the reading was 20 times better than the summary. The reading gave us so many more nuances and insights into what she was thinking. So we did get the detail. We got the extra bits. And we used a basic prior knowledge summary template to get there. And we looked at the complementary nature of them. And we've got to understand that in reality, even though we may have put forward these two things as independent criteria, we can't really think of them as tick one box, tick the other box, you know. Find something fulfilling and make sure that it's larger than oneself. We've got to understand that when we actually say find something fulfilling, we assume also that that fulfilling thing is going to be worthwhile, right? We just don't, it's just not immediately apparent to us. You know, it's just implied though when we actually go and do a further analysis of it. When we say find something larger than oneself, we make the assumption that you will have a subjective attachment to it that's positive, and that's how you will find the meaning in it. So really, by saying, you know, if we say you will have a meaningful life if you find something larger than yourself, we're not really meaning just that. We are actually implying, though we haven't consciously thought of it, that you will find a subjective attachment or yearning for it. In other words, when we suggest the one, we're actually suggesting the other. And the two kind of really are a unity. And that unity goes back to the formulation of meaning, that meaning is created when one acts out of reasons for love, the subjective component, on a worthwhile independent source, the objective component. Hence, we move now to the idea of the fitting fulfillment view. You live a fulfilling life. And I guess too, now I'm thinking about it, that's why she goes here in a way that contradicts herself. She's saying, look, I need to reinvent this idea of fulfillment. I like the idea of fulfillment. But for me, the idea of fulfillment does imply, most people would assume, that you do act on something that is worthwhile, even though previous definitions haven't implied it. They've just come from a subjective point of view, right? So that's why I think she's introduced this part. She's saying, look, it implies that fulfillment implies that you act on something worthwhile. And now she's probably going to build that into her fitting fulfillment view. Okay? And so the two aren't just working alongside each other. Usually when you suggest you find meaning using one thing, you unconsciously assume that the other's going to happen as well. The two need to happen together at the same time. All right. So go yourself, take some notes. I hope we've been really clear. I hope you understand why the reading is so much more important than the writing. The details and the information here are just so much more well developed, and you really get a deep insight into what she's saying. Cheers.